Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar, Making Refugee Participation in Protection Community Dialogues Meaningful. My name is Susan Fratsky, and I am a Senior Policy Analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. I'd like to start with just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, if you have any technical problems, please email events@migrationpolicy.org. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the call. There will not be a voice question and answer, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, or you can email them to events@migrationpolicy.org. I am also very happy to note that our event today is coinciding with the release of a new report being published by MPI on building meaningful refugee participation into protection policymaking by Uwezo Ramazani, who is also one of our speakers today. The webinar and the report are part of the Beyond Territorial Asylum Initiative, Making Protection Work in a Bordered World, which we are convening together with the Robert Bosch Stiftung. The report and more information about the initiative are available on our website at the links that you can see on your screen. I also want to especially thank the refugee-led research for its support during the development of the report that was released today. And I'd now like to pass it over to Hannes Einsborn, who is a Senior Project Manager for Migration at the Robert Bosch Stiftung, for some opening reflections on his side. Hannes?
Thank you very much, Susan, and I'm very excited to be here and for the discussion today. And also welcome on behalf of the Robert Bosch Foundation. And maybe a very quick reflection and observation at the beginning. The GRF 3.5 years ago in 2019, there was only 2.3% of refugees participating in the forum. And in order for them to participate, there was before a lot of advocacy by refugee-led civil society. And there was a lot of hurdles that had to be removed, organizations working in the background, including from philanthropy, to make this happen. And now fast forward this year's GRF, 3.5 years later, or 4 years later then, the preparations have been very different. There has been a formal mechanism with the ambition to have more meaningful refugee participation in the preparations. There is, when you listen to the discussions and the preparation sessions, there's a very different language in terms of discussion and debate around meaningful refugee participation. So I think there is a lot has happened, and I think we can really speak of an emerging norm. And this is something that is not my argument, but it's an argument by Res Gardi and James Milner and Mustafa Ayo. So refugee participation is really the new way of doing things in multilateral diplomacy that affects refugees. So I think this discussion and the report is very timely and important. It allows to take stock of what's out there in terms of different models of participation. It looks at learnings, it looks at the evidence of what actually meaningful refugee participation is able to achieve in protection policymaking. So congratulations to MPI, but also especially to Uwezo for this excellent report. And I think this report really provides a critical assessment of the different models of participation, and also it looks at the critical factors that shape how meaningful refugee participation can be. We've seen a lot of representation. There is some progress when it comes to representation, but I think that also needs to be matched up with resources. So I'm also very excited about this year's GRF, also to see how increasing resources hopefully will be made available to refugee-led organizations to really have representation and resources going along at the same time. And I think this also is increasingly important to address a key criticism that's also being raised when it comes to refugee participation, that refugee advisors, experts are not diverse enough. And I think if we really invest in the civil society that's led by refugees, we can really sort of build that diverse group of refugee leaders that can participate in discussions. So I think that's one area where we still have some way to go. And maybe a final few words about sort of how this topic relates to the initiative in my perspective. I mean, in the initiative with the Migration Policy Institute, we really try to look at trends, transformative changes to the protection system. And as I've introduced, and as my colleagues have argued, meaningful refugee participation is really a transformative change that's happening in the system. But I think also what we try to do in the initiative is also discuss solutions. And I think, as also Uwezo has brilliantly argued in the report, having refugees participate, co-designing policies is really a key success factor in making them more legitimate and more effective. So I end by that, and I'm really excited about listening to the different experts in this call, and I really recommend you checking out the report by Uwezo and MPI. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Hannes. I think some really relevant points there, both with regard to the shifting, really a shifting norm around refugee participation, and also I think around the ways in which refugee participation can actually contribute to solutions thinking. And as you noted, Hannes, this is, of course, a key part of the initiative that we're leading together, is trying to engage really in thinking through pragmatic solutions. We are coming up on another major sort of event in the calendar this year, which is World Refugee Day next week. And ahead of World Refugee Day, UNHCR had released its Global Trends in Displacement report earlier this week, which noted that 35.3 million individuals are now living outside their home countries as refugees as of 2022. And I think for anyone who has been following or been affected, by displacement situations over the last several years, it can feel like we're stuck in something of a loop of ever greater and greater numbers of displacements that are facing the international community. And it's true, of course, that new crises keep popping up on the horizon. This past year, it was Ukraine. There's also continuing displacement from Afghanistan and from Venezuela that keep driving ever higher numbers of displacement. But I think we can also acknowledge that the international protection system is also facing a lack of legal and practical solutions that are available to help address displacement. And this is another reason why we keep seeing more and ever greater numbers every year of displacement. This puts a tremendous amount of strain on humanitarian systems that are meant to support and protect people who are refugees. And we have more and more people who are needing to turn to a pool of resources that is itself not growing. And this, I think, as Hannes mentioned, really means that the international community needs to ensure that the policy and programmatic tools that we're using are as effective as possible, that they're targeted in the right way, and they're really making the most of the resources that are available. So when countries are providing humanitarian or development support to refugee hosting countries, that support is going to the right place and it's being used in the most effective and efficient way possible, or that when a new resettlement or legal pathway opens for refugees, that those pathways are available to and accessible to people who would most benefit from them. And one of the tools, as Hannes mentioned, that's been put forward in recent years to try to make policies and programs more effective, and as Uwezo also outlines in his paper, is of course involving refugees themselves in policymaking and in programmatic design processes. And I think there's a really elegant case for that and persuasive case that Uwezo has outlined in his analysis, and that we'll dig into in more depth in our conversation today. So our conversation brings together really a fantastic group of individuals who have been working on refugee participation for many years now. And I'm really excited to be sitting with this group for the next hour to hear their thoughts on how refugee participation can affect policy outcomes, how we can ensure that participation is being done in a way that can actually link up to concrete outcomes within the policy space, and then also thinking through how we can actually measure and evaluate those outcomes to ensure that we're working towards a more effective participation going forward. So I'd like to hand it over first to Uwezo Ravizani, who, as I mentioned, is the author of the paper that came out today. He is also a lead researcher at the Refugee-Led Research Hub at the University of Oxford. And Uwezo is based in Tanzania and himself has a lived experience of displacement. And in addition to his work with the Refugee-Led Research Hub, he has also worked as a lead researcher for the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network at Carleton. And he previously worked with Resilience Action International, which is a refugee-led organization operating mainly in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And he was most recently the interim executive director of that organization. So I'll hand it over to Uwezo to talk to us about his research and the findings of the report. Uwezo.
Thank you, Susan, for the opportunity. I hope I'm audible enough. Yes, generally, the report has found that all stakeholders have now seen the need to have more effective policies to address protection and displacement challenges. And one way to get there is to meaningfully engage refugees themselves in policy-making processes to ensure their knowledge, expertise, and unique perspectives are reflected in program design, and that they have a sense of, or a shared sense of ownership over implementation. While refugees are increasingly becoming involved in these processes, there is no clear evidence on how concretely refugee participation can foster better policies. Also, I've seen that there have been limited effort to create theory of change that outline how refugee participation are supposed to achieve the intended goals. This gives stakeholders an opportunity to sharpen their understanding of the goals of refugee participation, how to best reach them, and how to remove barriers that impede the progress of refugee participation. So I have seen and identified the motivation to engage refugees is often the moral argument that those who have been forcibly displaced should be involved in making decisions that affect them. And based on the analysis of this report, all initiatives, current initiatives to engage refugees in policy-making processes fall under one of the following models. The first model is a consultative model, the second is the advisory model, and the third one is the professional model. And this categorization is based on 4 key variables that create the parameters within which influence can be generated. And those parameters are the level of engagement, the number of participants that are involved, the time frame that consultations take place, and whether those who participate are considered as outsiders or insiders. For instance, for the consultative model, engagement is likely, but many are involved in the consultations. And you'll find that the time frame for consultation is so limited. They may be involved in one session only, but the later sessions they want to be involved. And we have seen this, for example, the consultation ahead of the Global Compact on Refugees and the development of the Refugee Act in Kenya. In the advisory model, you can see that
Uwezo, can you still hear us? I think we might have lost the connection. Are you back?
Sorry?
Can you hear us?
Hello?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
We lost you for just a moment. I think just as you were talking about the advisory model.
Yes, I said in the advisory model, the degree of engagement is deep compared to consultative, where there is light touch. Though the number of participants in the advisory model is limited, is few compared to the consultative. And in the advisory model, you can see that advisors may be engaged in several sessions compared to the consultative, where people may be only invited in one session. And in the advisory model, advisors are considered as outsiders because they are not a part of those organizing the consultation or the engagement. For instance, in the UNHCR Commission, these advisors to the Canada government, and the advisors that we have seen created in the US and in the German, those advisors are considered as outsiders. And in the professional model, it's where few refugees are recruited to be part of the organizations, and their engagement is so deep also, but few get there and they participate continuously because they are already part of the organization. And this time, they are now considered as insiders within that organization. So they participate as members of the organization. And one example is the appointment of the CEO of Asylum Access, who has experience of forced displacement. So those are the three models that I've identified and the factors that determines their level of engagement. So it is important now to know.
Wait, so I think we have we've lost you again.
Hello?
Are you still there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
So evaluating refugee participation success requires developing and communicating a clear theory of change, allow stakeholders to think through and clearly articulate their intended goals. Now, if you don't develop a clear theory of change against which we can measure the influence of participation, it will be difficult. So more broadly, refugees engagement still needs a greater push to move away from symbolism or tokenism and to instead meaningfully involve the refugee communities in policy decisions that affect them. So we can engage refugees through multiple entry points and pilot a variety of participation models that I've mentioned. We can also document the participation of refugees in the policy process, but also finally we have to move beyond the refugee participation in the processes that are led by others and to co-design and co-ownership of policy making and programming. As many refugees find themselves in protracted situations of displacement, deeper, continuous engagement and co-design are critical to addressing recurring and long-term challenges. Thank you for listening, and I will be happy to receive questions if there are any addressed to me.
Thank you so much, Uwezo. We'll turn now to Rez Gardi, and if you have questions for Uwezo, please go ahead and put them in the chat or send them on email to the events MPI events address, and we'll take them all together at the end. Rez is an international lawyer and human rights activist of Kurdish descent, and she currently serves as the co-managing director of Refugees Seeking Equal Access to the Table, or RSEAT. She represented New Zealand at the first ever Global Refugee Youth Consultations in 2016 and helped establish the Global Youth Advisory Council to the UNHCR, and is a co-founding member of the Refugee Steering Group to the UNHCR Annual Tripartite Consultations on Resettlement, and leads as one of its representatives. So I'm very happy to turn it over now to Rez to tell us a bit about how she has witnessed refugee participation initiatives developing over the past few years, especially since the GCR process. And I also just want to acknowledge and thank Rez for joining from New Zealand, where it's actually quite late in the evening her time. So Rez, pass it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Ena mana, ena reo, ena whenua o te ao, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever in the world you're dialing in from. I greet you firstly in Te Reo Māori, the language of the tangata whenua Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I was fortunate to find a home free from persecution. I am the co-managing director of RSEAT, Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table. We are a global refugee-led organization working to enhance the effectiveness of global refugee responses by co-designing mechanisms to amplify refugee leadership ecosystems and increase the participation of refugees in a meaningful, sustainable, and transformative way. I think, as noted by various speakers before me, over the last few years, we've seen a prominent theme within the global refugee regime and related meetings as a commitment to enhancing the role of refugees in the making and implementation of policies and programming that affect us. As articulated in paragraph 34 of the Global Compact on Refugees, responses are most effective when they actively and meaningfully engage those that they are intended to protect and assist. It's clear currently that many stakeholders are committed to the principle of meaningful refugee participation, but the challenge has been trying to understand what this means practically. While there's been a lot of agreement on the value of refugee participation, there are still practical ideas that are needed on how participation can be more substantive, more sustained, and pragmatic. So it's about moving from the if to the how. And naturally, we've seen various refugee participatory initiatives develop in an attempt to put into practice this commitment. And this has taken various forms within national, regional, and global contexts. At the global level, we've seen the development of key advisory bodies within the UNHCR framework, for example, the Refugee Advisory Group to the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement, also the UNHCR Advisory Board. I know we have our colleague here from UNHCR, Tamar, that will speak more on that. So I'll focus more on the mechanisms that our seat has helped to create within national contexts. At our seat, we believe there is an emerging norm of meaningful refugee participation in the international refugee system. And as Hannes has pointed out, we've published an article to explain why we think so. But for the sake of brevity, just take my word for now that there isn't an emerging norm, and that this emerging norm has the potential to substantially ameliorate global refugee responses. This norm's realization has been the inspiration for the refugee advisory model that our seat has taken, wherein refugee leaders can collaborate with governments to develop and promote more effective and accountable refugee policy responses, both at the state level and into the global. So building from the Canadian model, we've worked with numerous partners on the ground to help establish mechanisms, for example, the United States Refugee Advisory Board and the New Zealand Refugee Advisory Panel, and we're actively working in other states to create such mechanisms. And thinking about these mechanisms, I'll just cover how they're built firstly. So we work with refugee leaders and refugee-led organizations, academic partners, and other civil society stakeholders leading up to the Selection Advisory Committee for an open and transparent selection process. We adapt to each national context and recognize where existing mechanisms exist and how we can ensure that these are meaningful and can work in a positive collaborative relationship with the government. So it's about complementing, not duplicating or replacing existing efforts. The process of building the mechanisms is led by local refugee leaders and RLOs. Our seat's role is more as a tool with technical expertise, convening regular spaces for exchanges, and in some cases helping to support the connection with funding partners, and then there to support the mechanisms. And how do they work? Depending on each country context, whether countries would like to engage the mechanism at the national and international or just at the international level, really depends on the context, the structures they've already got, the relationship of RLOs and civil societies with government partners and agencies. So it's very context specific. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather working with actors on the ground to understand what would work in their unique context and how we can support the establishment of such a mechanism. A critical part of these mechanisms is also that from within these mechanisms, refugee advisors are connected with the governments to serve on the international for example, whether it's the ATCR, whether it's the XCOM, and hopefully the upcoming GRF, and they're selected from this transparent process. So members of these mechanisms not only have lived experience of forced displacement, but they also have expertise in relevant fields. Our seat supports the efficient running of these mechanisms by providing training and supporting where capacity is needed to these members, and also various trainings and tools on how to navigate global refugee policy processes. It's still very early days, so we can't conclusively conclude that they are a model that definitely works. But some key indicators about why they have the potential to be successful models is that they're institutionalized, embedded mechanisms, and they're not ad hoc. We're trying to move away from tokenistic approaches by ensuring that there's an independent selection committee process that helps with an open call for applications from refugees within that country's context that is transparent. Members of these advisory bodies are chosen based on their expertise, not just lived experience alone, but that powerful combination. And they're well prepared to advise the governments on particular refugee policy issues within their area of expertise. These mechanisms are designed to be sustainable, so ensuring that there's a sufficient resourcing to ensure that it's not a one-off approach, but actually focus on longevity, because obviously policy processes can take many years and commitment over a long period of time. These mechanisms reside at the national level to affect change, but on the international level as well. And other key components are these rotational models to ensure that there's diversity within the cohorts and that they're limited term, so they're not the same people forever. And a key component of this is a secretariat body that supports the mechanisms, usually a university or academic partner, which ensures a evidence-based approach to affecting change at the policy level. So just to fill the gap, on the final point is it's bridging this from what Uizo's outlined in his report, trying to bridge these different models, so the advisory and the professional approach, to ensure that it's more meaningful over the long term. I'll stop there and for the sake of time, but I'd be happy to answer more questions and look forward to discussion on this point. Back to you. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Rez. And a reminder, as you have questions for Rez or for Uizo, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'd like to turn now to Shaza Al-Rihawi, who is the co-founder and former chair of the Global Refugee-led Network, as well as the co-founder of the Global Independent Refugee Women Leaders and the Network for Refugee Voices. She is also a board member of New Women Connectors and a former member of the European Migrant Advisory Board, and previously worked for UNHCR in Syria. So I'll hand it over now to Shaza to talk about what participation opportunities you've seen emerging at UNHCR and in the global level, and sort of what challenges and opportunities you've observed as part of those processes. Shaza?
Thanks for this invitation, and I'm happy to add to what already have been said, actually, about the importance of the meaningful participation, and more about how, because the importance is already there. So actually, it is essential to acknowledge that the efforts have been made to increase the refugee participation, but there is still much progress to be made. Here are some key aspects of the process of participation opportunities for refugees at UNHCR and the global level. First, the refugee representation, and here to have like a representative from refugees in the discussions, consultation, and decision-making process in many different levels. Second, refugee advisory board and committees, and here UNHCR is playing a big role to have all of this process, and to have many different refugee advisory groups in many different themes, if we can say. Refugee consultation, also UNHCR conduct a lot of consultation with refugees to have their opinion and feedback on issues affecting their lives. And in addition to that, the Global Refugee Forum, ATCR, and other forums that's happening, refugee already is invited, but again, here we have like a limitation of access for refugees because they always have to be invited. They cannot come by their own. And advocacy and awareness, here we all working with UNHCR hand by hand to inclusive policies and practices that recognize the respect of the voice of refugees. Now we will talk about the challenges and the opportunities for refugee and meaningful refugee participation. First one is the legal and the policy framework, ensuring that the legal and policy framework provide opportunities for refugees to participate meaningfully in this significant role. First, we can see that the inclusive policies to grant the refugees the right for work, access for education, the healthcare, and the social services. Recognizing refugees as valuable contributors to the society, creating opportunities for their participation instead of viewing the refugees and RLOs as beneficiaries. It is crucial to treat them as an equal partner and an essential actor in the process. Developing theory of change, establishing measurable indicator will facilitate adaptation of more inclusive approaches. Collectively designing, implementing, and evaluating process and policies between refugees and policymakers is essential factor to overcoming the challenges in the front of achieving the meaningful participation or meaningful engagement for refugees. Second, social and cultural integration. Refugees often face challenges in social and cultural integration due to language barriers, discrimination, and limitation of social network. Opportunities is raised here by promoting cultural exchange, intercultural dialogue, and community engagement. Economic empowerment. Limit access to economic opportunities is a significant challenge for the refugees. And here we would like to have restricted work permits, limited formal employment access, and skill mismatch. To address this, we can create opportunity through vocational training, entrepreneurship initiatives, and collaboration with business. Recognition refugees' skills and experience is enabled for the meaningful contribution to the local economy. Education and skills development. Quality education and skills development is crucial for refugees to actively participate in the host societies. Participation in the decision-making process. Challenges such as a limited participation or presentation, lack of information, the power imbalance must be overcome. Creating opportunities essential to foster inclusive governance structure, establishing refugee-led organization, supporting them, funding them, promoting dialogue platforms, and involving refugees in policy development and implementation is a key. Mental health and well-being. Refugees facing traumatized experience, displacement, and loss during their journey is all that impacting their mental health and well-being. The challenge is to limit access to mental health services, cultural stigmatization, and language barriers. And here we would like to have accessible and culturally sensitive mental health support, raising awareness and involving refugees in designing and implementing mental health programs. As a GRN, we are learning from our global, from local to the global level engagement and vice versa, that refugee participation pledge is a key. Actually, as a GRN, we had the pledge in the last forum, and now we had over 50 state and NGOs signing this pledge, and we would like to have more towards the GRF. Regional refugee summits have brought together hundreds and hundreds of refugees leaders worldwide, providing a platform for policy discussion and input into the global compact on refugee process. So what we are trying to bring all refugees to come together from the local to the global, to let them have their recommendations, share their notes, and share their policies recommendation with the global level. Independent refugee delegation have been also facilitated to engage directly with the policymakers and they will deliver refugees statement in the key policy events. We create as a GRN Skill Up Training. It's a capacity building workshop series by refugees for refugees to empower refugees to be able to transforming the knowledge and the skills that necessary for policy engagement. As a GRN, we are responding to urgent refugee community needs through regional chapter, ensuring that the refugee voices are centered in. Actually, this is the way where we try to have refugee meaningfully engaged in the policy debate, if we can say, and we would like to have the more power for refugees to have equal partnership again and again and not seen as beneficiaries. Thanks.
Thank you, Shaza. I want to turn now to our last panelist, Tamar Suzanne Yohannin, who is the acting head of Community-Based Protection Unit in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR, and is also the co-chair of UNHCR's task team on engagement and partnership with organizations led by displaced and stateless persons. So I'll turn now to Tamar to share a bit about how UNHCR is trying to facilitate meaningful refugee engagement ahead of the GRF.
Thanks a lot, Susan, and everybody, all the other panelists as well. I'm so happy and proud to be with you with such a rich also panel for this day. And also thank you for inviting me for this discussion. I'm happy to share our recent experience in UNHCR on engaging displaced and stateless persons. Of course, it was already touched upon that we have already at the field level, we have a very strong community-based protection approach in the way that we work with the community. So already aspects of ensuring that we listen to them, we engage them in the identification of solutions, we invite them to the planning table, we provide feedback on what has happened with the information they shared with us. All that is already quite embedded in the work that we do in UNHCR, and we have a lot of examples to share on how this went beyond just a consultation with them, but also really building on their capacities to implement solutions. We wanted to mirror these most important efforts at the ground level to our in the global level, and this engagement is primarily, of course, driven by the New York Declaration with the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees, which also referred to recognized refugees as key to ensuring the responses are meaningful and effective. There were a lot of lessons learned from the first GRF, and those lessons have guided us and the efforts that we have been doing leading into the high-level officials meeting in 2021, and now the upcoming GRF 2023. So we took stock of what worked and what did not work, and we heard from refugees themselves what were the opportunities they saw at the GRF 2019 and the high-level official meeting, but also what were some of the challenges they experienced. So issues that were highlighted were around like the tokenistic participation and just the check the box kind of participation of refugees. Specific challenges related to inclusion and really like in-presence kind of participation of refugees, things related to logistics, travel, visa arrangements, aspects of representation, inclusion and accessibility for refugees of all age, gender and diversity background, but also more importantly, the need to engage early on in the process of the GRF and not at the end event that happened in 2019. So hearing all this, we at the headquarters level, we have established an interdivisional task team, which developed a framework with a set of deliverables to take this forward. So as a primary objective, the task team aimed to align internal efforts and increase the capacity of UNHCR to partner and engage with those organizations at various levels. Of course, the task team did not work alone. We worked with an interim advisory group, which also helped us develop a modality for selecting a more representative advisory board that has been now put in place following a fair and transparent process. So the process itself was quite lengthy. It took us 9 months to have the advisory board together, but we are happy that we did it as to the extent possible in a consultative way and transparent way. It was, of course, a refugee-led process. So the interim advisory group developed the terms of reference, developed the modality of selection, supported the review of the candidates and the shortlisting and longlisting of the candidates, and following, of course, a scoring system and a clear criteria that was also developed jointly with them. The criteria in selection the advisory board also considered, first of all, geographical balance. So we wanted to make sure that we have members representing different regions where UNHCR operates, but more importantly, AGD representation. So we have members who represent LGBTI organization, persons with disability, stateless organization, because we want to take this engagement beyond refugees. As an organization, we have a mandate also towards IDPs and stateless persons, as you know. But also, like, we wanted to make sure that we have a balance between regional and grassroots representation, because they each bring their own very different and rich perspective into the discussions and the deliverables of the task team. The terms of reference of the advisory board includes advising UNHCR on meaningful participation to start with. Where are we doing wrong? Where can we do better? Influencing policy development was one key ask that they wanted to put on the table. They want to be part of the discussions around developing, like, for instance, the child protection policy, the strategy on livelihood and economic inclusion, which are things that are already now ongoing with the advisory board. But also, most importantly, the next big thing, and that's influencing and engaging at the GRF itself. Maybe just to say a bit of the efforts that we have been doing around the GRF. So listening also to what we heard from the previous GRF, the engagement early on. So the GRF event itself is kind of the end result, where people will come there, present their pledges, discuss issues around priorities and so on. But we want to make sure that this engagement is happening already before, during the process of those pledges being developed. So we are engaging with the advisory board in the preparatory meetings around the GRF. They have had opportunities to provide their own statements, put forward their messages on prioritizing meaningful participation, but also ensuring that it is inclusive of the different age, gender, and diversity group. So even some practical kind of messaging around how to make sure that refugees can be there in time, starting the process early on in terms of visa arrangements and so on. We also facilitate inclusion of organizations led by displaced people, and this of course goes beyond the advisory board, in relevant coordination groups that are currently active around the GRF. For example, the agender group of friends that is working on AGD priorities, but also the NGO reference group, where we also have representatives from the advisory board also there to make sure that inputs from those organizations are also heard. We have also made efforts at the regional level and at country level to ensure local actors, including refugee-led organizations, are part of those conversations. And of course, as the rest said, this is quite different from one context to another, depending on capacity, on the legal framework, on the openness, where that's possible, and we continue to advocate for this to happen more systematically. We heard from the first GRF also the need to ensure that we identify the right people for the right role. It comes again to the tokenistic kind of participation. So in January, a call for expert refugees was sent out. And we are trying to really identify refugees who have specific expertise in thematic areas, for instance, livelihoods, health, climate, all the areas that could be discussed in the conversations around the GRF. So the advisory board is currently supporting the review and the shortlisting of those list of experts to bring it down to 70 experts that will be connected with the regional bureaus to be involved in those regional discussions, but also at the GRF itself, where we hope to be able to bring them all even to be present at the GRF discussions. There are, of course, other refugee coordination mechanisms, of course, in place. So Rez already referred to the ATCR Refugee Advisory Group. There are also advisory groups linked to the DAFI students, for instance, the Global Youth Council. But just as an example for the work that we are doing with the refugee students, for instance, the DAFI students. So engagement has already started now with them because they will be present at the GRF. But it's not about just bringing them at the event itself. It's about really supporting their role at the GRF. So some of them have, for instance, requested support in coaching on public speaking, for instance. So these are kind of the things that are also currently ongoing to make sure that as we come closer to the GRF, they are able to also present their priorities in the most effective way. Supporting pledges on meaningful participation. So Shaza referred to the GRN pledge. That's one that we have been also supporting actively, but also making sure that meaningful participation is across the board, also integrated in all pledge development. And then, of course, there is the ongoing development of a localization pledge, which will also include elements of engagement with refugee-led organizations. These are just a few examples of the kind of work that is happening around the GRF. And happy to come back maybe during the Q&A to also provide additional information. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jafar. Very interesting to hear the deep work that UNHCR is doing ahead of the GRF to ensure both appropriate representation and also really in-depth and prepared representation and relevant representation on the part of the refugee delegations. I'd like to open the floor now for questions. Please, as a reminder, place your questions in the Q&A box. We have quite a few interesting ones that have already come in, so I will get started on putting those to our panelists. And as you have more questions or comments, please feel free to add them. First question I want to direct actually specifically to Shaza and Rez. Our conversation has touched quite a bit on the merits of refugee participation, what it can add, but I can imagine that in working with governments and with national governments and with international actors, there's also been some resistance. Of course, if there hadn't been some resistance, we would have more refugee participation already today. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to which specific concerns you've seen come up in your conversations with national governments and international actors, and how you've addressed those. Why, where have there been concerns about bringing refugees in more depth, and how have you seen those hesitations play out? So I might ask Shaza if you would like to come in first and then turn to Rez.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, it's not easy for refugees to be included in such debates, and it's not in all states and in all countries. Like we can see in Canada, in US, in Germany, somehow they are more open to have refugees in their debates. They are more open to talk to the refugees, having refugee councils. And with the RC, they are working on creating advisory groups. It is really an opportunity and a big opportunity for us to be included with the states. But if we go to other kind of states where they are more hosting countries with limited resources, if we can say, and with somehow not the democratic regimes, it is not easy to have refugee voices to be heard, such as refugee in Lebanon, refugee in Jordan, refugee in some African countries and some other countries. They still work silently on the ground, but no one listens to them. Also, one of the problems sometimes is the language barriers. So it's not always helping that refugees doesn't speak the language of the countries where they are. So also this is some of the barriers that preventing refugees to come over this. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to help refugees to understand also not only the language itself, but also the policy language, because it's not easy. And this is one of the things that where refugees are not able to come to the debates itself. And what we are trying to do is to have our summits as a GRN, we try to come up with the refugees on local level, trying to talk to each other and then bring this knowledge to the states and to the government when we have the opportunities, because in the global level, it's more open, actually, to be honest, to have this kind of discussion than the regional and the local level. So we still have a long way to reach where we would like to reach, but actually this is how we have worked so far from our side.
Thank you, Shaza. Rez, would you like to come in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question. And I think the reality is that every context and state is different. So, for example, there may be some states where the conversation is really around the ethical imperative and the accountability to affected populations, and that in itself is enough to be a driving factor in terms of trying to include refugee voices. And that's really critical. But I think sometimes we need to go further than that, and we need to discuss the substantive value to having refugees participate. And we need to all put at the forefront of our minds, what is it that we're trying to achieve by having refugees participate? So thinking about what do we collectively want to achieve? And if it's about thinking about the global refugee response system, I think many of us can agree here that there are a lot of things that are not working within the global regime. And so by having refugee perspectives, by including refugees within these processes, then decision makers and policy makers and governments can access more information directly from people that are most affected, to better identify the existing problems, to address the gaps in services that are currently being experienced by people on the ground, and they can receive input that can lead to more innovative, robust solutions. And so we need to think about, what are we trying to achieve here? Meaningful refugee participation is not an end goal in itself. It is a means to achieving the ultimate goal, which we all collectively can agree is a better global refugee response system for all of us. And by including refugee voices, we can make the policy process more effective and legitimate. And it's also thinking about the investment. So for many countries, they're investing a lot of resources and time into global responses, whether it's within their local context, regional, national, global. And so by having a better channel of communication and working in stronger partnership with all stakeholders, including refugees, then we can make that goal more realistic, more achievable. And so it's thinking about the pragmatic solutions to this. One of the first questions we get when we're engaging with states is, they're not going to say this maybe publicly, but what is in it for the government? What is in it for the state to do this? And so it's thinking about all of this together, the ethical imperative, the accountability to affected populations, but also the contributions, the substantive value to the policy-making processes and the outcomes that we can achieve together, and then being able to combine these. And Shaza rightly pointed out, for many countries, resources is an issue. They're already really finding it difficult to focus on really key essential services, and so asking them to do something in addition to that is a major challenge. And this is where I think as an international community, we need to be thinking more honestly about how do we resource these initiatives to ensure that refugees can participate, and where are we directing these resources? How can private sector partners come into this? How can academic partners come into this? How can we all work hand in hand? Because it's not just about refugees getting a seat at the table, but rather working collectively together.
Thank you so much, Raz. I think those comments go to the heart of many of the things that we're discussing here today about how refugee participation can really influence and lead to more effective policy making. We just have a few minutes left, and there are two questions I want to pick up on actually coming out of the chat and what Shaza and Raz just shared. The first is in the chat, we've had a request to share examples, some concrete examples of where our panelists have seen refugee participation really lead to stronger policy or programmatic outcomes. So specific examples of where policies have fed into a process to make it more, the outcomes, in fact, more effective. And I want to address that first to Tamar and then to Uwezo. But there's a second question I want to put on the table as well, which goes to what Rez just mentioned, which is, how do we actually resource refugee participation? And I might ask Hannes if you would be prepared to come in on that after Tamar and Uwezo speak. We've heard a lot from our panelists today about the importance of ensuring that refugee participation models are well supported and well prepared, whether that is involves providing language access services or providing refugee participants with support on things like developing public speaking skills or enabling them to effectively engage in processes, as well as simply resourcing things like travel and actually the time to participate in processes. So be curious about our panelists, the thoughts from our panelists, and also from Hannes, what kinds of resources are needed and who should actually be involved in providing those resources to enable refugee participation. So I'll turn first to Tamar to take up the question about where we've seen specific examples of refugee participation leading to change.
Thanks a lot, Susan, and also colleagues who asked the question. I think, the examples are, of course, like different from one context to another. I mean, if I think more of the global context, for instance, compared to the field perspective, This is an area that we are just now starting to really advance on. As I mentioned, the advisory board was just established a few months ago. They have already started contributing to some key policy documents at the UNHCR's level, including the child protection policy, the livelihood strategy. Recently, we had an experience on developing a refugee-led organization definition. There were, of course, a lot of lessons learned from that experience as well, and we continue to continuously improve the way we are doing also consultations. So I think there is, as also, I don't know who mentioned, like the no one size fits all. It's very important for us to see where refugees themselves are, what their priorities are, and not to always like impose our own priorities on them, and what kind of documents we want them to really review or policies we want them to influence. They might have their own priorities that we need to also listen to and make sure these are embedded. When I think of some of the other activities where we have advanced on, and I think the GRF itself has been quite when I think about the difference from 2019 to today, I think there has been a lot done already in including refugees in the process of the GRF, and now increasingly also in the development of pledges. Of course, those results we will only see later on, but it comes again to one of the challenges that were mentioned, like how do we really measure that this participation led to this result, and that this participation was the result of the outcomes that we are seeing now, because often it has a lot of contributing also factors attached to it. Of course, there is still a systematic power dynamics that will need to be continuously addressed, making sure that UNHCR and other actors fix those power dynamics. And the more we engage meaningfully with the displaced and status people, the more we will be able to work as equal partners. Over to you.
Thank you, Tamar. I want to hand over to Wezo. You've, of course, also, in addition to this report, done a lot of work with refugee-led organizations. I'd be curious through your work where you've seen refugee participation lead to specific better outcomes.
Thank you. And this, I think I can point out the refugee consultations during the development of the Kenyan's Refugee Act of 2021. Although the results appear to be mixed, but I think the fact that some of the refugee concerns, such as how refugees and the communities could better share resources, were included in the updated refugee bill, is a sign of some success of involvement of refugees. Because before the 2021, the former bill that was proposed was cancelled after the president denied to sign it. But with this second process, at least refugees were consulted. Members of parliament went to major refugee camps in Dadaab and Kakuma, and they gathered input from the refugees themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Wezo. So the final question we had on the table is with regard to financing and support, and how refugee participation can be supported through funding, and what kinds of resources are needed to do that. So I wanted to see, Hannes, if there's anything you wanted to add specifically on that point, and then open it for any final words from the rest of our panelists. Hannes?
I'm happy to provide a few comments, but I think also we have a wealth of experience from Shasa, Rez, and Wezo, who all are leading refugee-led organizations. So I think they also probably will have a lot to add to this discussion. But just from our perspective in philanthropy, I think there's two dimensions to it, right? There is a dimension of quantity of funding that goes to refugee-led organizations, and we see that sort of resources for organizations, but also for participation increasing. I think there is, but I think still not enough. I think we've seen a lot of resources that have come from philanthropy that has been sort of spearheading this and trying to put a lot of funding on the table. But I think now there's also UNHCR having specific programs for refugee-led organizations. There's also some governmental donors that are working this space. So I think we are seeing sort of the diversity of donors and funding available increasing. But I think the second aspect, besides the quantity of funding, is also the quality of funding. And I think a lot of the things that are needed in order for meaningful refugee participation to take place is basically funding core costs of organizations, providing stability, providing multi-year funding, providing flexible funding. So I think these are all things that I think we're not there yet. I think we are sometimes overly restrictive when it comes to specific organizations, smaller organizations, local organizations. So I think there's a lot of things that need to improve on that front. But we see a lot of different models that are happening internationally, and I think we could do a similar studies around refugee financing models that are very interesting. And I think there's some well-working models like the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative and others. And also, we are actually working with the Overseas Development Institute on a study that actually looks at this question of quantity and quality of funding. And there will be more sort of information and comments and data on this question. So I think also watch that space for some upcoming more input on that question. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Hannes. I'm afraid we are actually at time now. I just want to give an opportunity for our panelists to say just a couple of final words. Perhaps I'll turn to Shaza first, and then to Uwezo, Tamar, and then Rez, if you have any final comments to make on the financing point or other points that have come up through the chat. Just 1 or 2 minutes each, please.
Yeah, thank you for this invitation, and hope this discussion will continue. For the funding, core funding for our laws is really essential, because this is one of the problematic issues that we're facing as our laws, and more open for refugees and our laws to be invited for the discussions, with an open for the limitation, as we know that sometimes the forums is not that much for everyone, I know, but also having more refugees on the table is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaza. Tamar, any final words from your end, either on this point or other points that have been raised?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe on the resourcing, concerning the GRF, so the GRF UNHCR has committed to facilitate the participation of 100 refugees at the GRF. So we are still trying to secure the funding for that, of course. But at the same time, we are also advocating with the different actors, NGOs, states, to also include refugees in their delegations, building on the also very good practices that RC just touched upon. More on the programmatic side, we have been working also on simplifying a bit some of the modalities to access funding for RLO. So I can also share additional information about those access to small seed funding for organizations that are not registered, for instance, which is one of the big also challenges for those organizations on the ground. Over.
Thank you, Tamar. Uwezo, final thoughts on your side.
Thank you. I would like to say in the lead up of the 2023 Global Refugee Forum, I think the state, UNHCR, and non-governmental actors alike have an important opportunity to strengthen the links between refugee participation initiatives goals and the design and operation, and the mechanisms for measuring progress toward the identified goals. So we should use this opportunity to have clear theory of change, and I've proposed in the report some of the indicators that can be used to measure the progress and influence of refugee participation in policy-making processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Uwezo. And Rez, you have the last word from our panel.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think as we continue over the years trying to develop what meaningful refugee participation means in practical ways, multiple initiatives have already come to fruition over the past years and will continue. And this speaks to the importance of meaningful refugee participation across sectors and across all levels. But I think a reminder that we also need to be very intentional. So when we're creating these initiatives and advisory mechanisms and different processes, I think it's very important to understand what we're trying to achieve and why we want refugees to participate. Because if we can't answer this question about why we're including refugees, then we risk tokenistic approaches and leading to practices that might just be a checkbox exercise, having a refugee at the table, but we're not actually thinking about what they can contribute to the space. So being really intentional about this, if there are predetermined decisions and refugees are invited after the fact, then that's already an opportunity that's been lost to gain perspectives from refugees. So just a few points to end on. Collectively within this call, in our respective different organizations and places that we're working, when we're inviting refugees, we need to know and understand why we're inviting them firstly, and then communicate to them why their views are being asked, what is the potential outcome, and then providing sufficient and adequate time for them to prepare so that their contributions can be substantive. Last-minute ad hoc approaches will not likely lead to substantive input. And in order to have meaningful participation, refugees need to be able to influence the outcomes. And so just ending on that note, that we're intentional about including refugees and the outcomes that we hope to collectively achieve. And I just want to echo Wezo's points that starting to quantify and map indicators of success and what this looks like can be really helpful for us in understanding where we were and where we've gotten to and what work still remains in order to have a more robust collective global response mechanism for all refugees around the globe. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to join our conversation today. It's been really an insightful discussion, I think, touching on both what we have to look forward to ahead of the GRF, as well as some of the important points to think through around ensuring that refugee participation is really meaningful, and what sorts of investments and thought needs to go into that, and what we can expect and how we can actually measure some of those outcomes. I also want to thank you, our audience, for taking the time to join this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. I apologize if we didn't get to any of the questions that you had put in the chat, but we aimed to get to as many as we could in the time that was allocated. An audio and video recording of the event will be available on the MPI website in a few days. If there are reporters on the line who would like to reach out, please feel free to contact Michelle Mittelstadt at Mittelstadt, MITTELSTADT at migrationpolicy.org with any questions. And please do be sure to check MPI's website for the report that we were talking about today, Building Meaningful Refugee Participation into Protection Policymaking by Wezo Rabazani. The report, as I mentioned at the top, is part of the Beyond Territorial Asylum Initiative, Making Protection Work in a Bordered World, that MPI is convening together with the Robert Bosch Foundation. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you with us on another occasion.